The camera is shaking. Audio is clipping from Bryce Johnson screaming. Through the chaos, you can hear something else, something massive moving through the brush. The thermal camera captures a heat signature that shouldn't exist, and then everything goes black. What happened in those 11 minutes of missing footage would change everything about Expedition Bigfoot. Not just the show, not just the investigation, but the way Bryce Johnson thinks about what's actually out there in those woods. Because whatever attacked him that night, it wasn't supposed to be real. Stay until the end of this video, because we're going to break down every second of the footage that almost didn't air, the injury that required immediate medical attention, and the detail in the thermal imaging that experts still can't explain. But first, you need to understand who Bryce Johnson is and why this attack represents something fundamentally different from anything that's happened on Expedition Bigfoot before. Bryce Johnson isn't your typical Bigfoot researcher stumbling through the woods with a flashlight hoping to catch a glimpse of something strange. He's a wildlife biologist with over 15 years of field experience. He's tracked mountain lions in California, studied bear behavior in Alaska, documented wolf packs in Montana. He knows how animals move, how they hunt, how they react when cornered or threatened, which is exactly what made him valuable to Expedition Bigfoot when the show launched on Travel Channel. The production needed someone who could distinguish between normal wildlife behavior and something genuinely anomalous. Someone who wouldn't mistake a bear for Bigfoot or interpret every broken branch as evidence of Sasquatch activity. Bryce brought scientific credibility to what could have easily become another sensationalized cryptid show. But here's what you need to understand about Bryce's approach to the investigation. He went in as a skeptic, not hostile to the idea of Bigfoot's existence, but demanding evidence that met scientific standards. Footprint casts weren't enough without clear dermal ridges and anatomically correct proportions. Audio recordings needed to be analyzed against known animal vocalizations. Eyewitness testimony had to be corroborated with physical evidence. For the first 3 seasons of Expedition Bigfoot, Bryce maintained that skeptical stance. The team found interesting data, thermal hits that were difficult to explain, vocalizations that didn't match cataloged animal sounds, massive footprints in remote locations. But Bryce always found ways to maintain scientific distance. Possible bear, could be misidentified elk, might be audio contamination from equipment. His colleagues, Dr. Maria Mayer and Russell Accord, sometimes expressed frustration with Bryce's caution. They'd capture compelling evidence and Bryce would immediately start poking holes in it, but that's what made the team dynamic work. Maria brought primatology expertise and field experience from decades of wildlife research. Russell provided tactical knowledge and an intuitive understanding of how to track elusive creatures. And Bryce served as the scientific filter, preventing the investigation from veering into pseudoscience, which is why what happened during the Season 4 investigation is so significant. Because Bryce Johnson, the skeptic who'd spent years demanding rigorous proof, experienced something that shattered his carefully maintained scientific objectivity. And that experience was captured on camera. The investigation that would lead to Bryce's attack took place in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, an area that's been a hotspot for Bigfoot sightings for over a century. But this wasn't a random location chosen for dramatic scenery. The team had spent months analyzing historical sighting reports, geographic data, and environmental factors to identify a specific valley that met all the criteria for potential Sasquatch habitat. The valley was remote, accessible only by hiking several miles through challenging terrain. It had a reliable water source from a creek that ran year-round, dense forest cover that would allow large animals to move undetected, and perhaps most importantly, a history of consistent sightings spanning decades, reported by loggers, hikers, and indigenous communities who'd lived in the region for generations. The expedition plan was methodical and scientific. The team would establish a base camp and conduct systematic searches using thermal imaging, audio recording equipment, camera traps, and traditional tracking methods. They'd work in pairs for safety, maintain radio contact, and document everything. Standard protocol for Expedition Bigfoot investigations. But there was something different about this location from the moment they arrived. Russell noticed it first. The forest was too quiet. Not the peaceful silence of wilderness, but an unnatural absence of sound. No birds, no insects. Even the wind seemed muted. Russell, who'd spent years in remote forests, said it reminded him of the eerie calm before a major predator appears. When bears or mountain lions are near, smaller animals go silent. The forest holds its breath. The first night passed without incident, though nobody slept well. The second day brought their first piece of evidence, a line of massive footprints near the creek pressed deep into mud. Bryce measured them at 17 inches long, far larger than any human foot and showing a pattern of weight distribution that suggested bipedal locomotion. He made casts, took photos, documented everything with his characteristic thoroughness. That evening, as darkness fell, the team heard something that made everyone stop talking. A vocalization echoing through the valley, starting low and guttural, almost like a growl, then rising to a high-pitched scream that seemed to last impossibly long. Mireya, who'd studied primate vocalizations worldwide, said it didn't match any known species, too complex for a bear, wrong frequency range for any North American ape or monkey. They decided to investigate, and that decision led to what would become the most significant and disturbing evidence in Expedition Bigfoot history, because Bryce Johnson was about to come face to face with something that would force him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about what exists in those forests. At 11:47 p.m., Bryce and Russell set out to investigate the vocalization's point of origin. They were equipped with thermal imaging cameras, handheld radios, and enough camera equipment to document anything they encountered. Mireya stayed at base camp monitoring their position via radio and reviewing real-time thermal feeds from their equipment. The footage from the first 20 minutes shows standard nighttime forest investigation. Bryce sweeping the thermal camera across the tree line, Russell calling out periodically, trying to provoke a response. Both men moving carefully through underbrush, their calm professional demeanor intact despite the darkness and isolation. At 12:08 p.m., the thermal camera picks up a heat signature approximately 200 yards ahead, large, upright, moving slowly through the trees parallel to their position. Bryce's narration becomes more focused. He's describing what he's seeing in real time. Bipedal movement, estimated height between 7 and 8 feet based on comparison to surrounding vegetation, behavior that suggests awareness of their presence. They decide to close the distance. This is where viewers who've watched the episode notice the shift in Bryce's body language. The scientific detachment is still there in his voice, but his movements become more cautious. Russell, typically the more aggressive investigator, actually suggests they maintain current distance and just observe, but Bryce wants closer footage, better thermal imaging, more definitive evidence. They advance. The thermal signature stops moving. On the footage, you can see it turn toward them. Not slowly, not with the uncertain movement of an animal trying to identify a threat. It pivots with purpose, with awareness, and then it starts moving toward them. This is the moment everything changes. Bryce and Russell both freeze. You can hear Russell say something that the audio doesn't quite capture, but his tone is clear. Concern. Real concern from a man who doesn't scare easily. Bryce is still filming, still documenting, but his breathing has changed. Faster, shallower. The figure on thermal gets closer. 150 yards, 100 yards. Moving faster now. And this is where the footage becomes difficult to watch, because you can see the exact moment when both men realize they're not observing anymore. They're being approached, possibly hunted. Russell makes the call. They're backing out. Not running, that might trigger a chase response, but strategic retreat. They start moving backward, keeping the thermal camera trained on the approaching figure. And for a moment, it seems like the plan is working. The figure stops advancing, stands there, visible on thermal, just watching them retreat. Then Bryce steps on something, a branch or root, and stumbles. Not a fall, just a momentary loss of balance, but that's all it takes. The thermal signature explodes into motion, covering the remaining distance at a speed that seems impossible for something that size. And this is where the footage gets chaotic. The camera is pointing at the ground, swinging wildly as Bryce tries to get his footing. You hear Russell shouting, Bryce yelling something unintelligible, and then a sound that doesn't belong to either man. A vocalization so loud it distorts the audio recording, so close it seems impossible that whatever made it wasn't directly on top of them. What happens next is captured in fragments. The camera catches glimpses of something massive moving past Bryce. The thermal imaging shows a heat signature at extremely close range, details visible that weren't clear before, and then impact. Something hits Bryce hard enough that he goes down. The camera flies from his hand, landing at an angle that captures both men and the space around them. For 11 seconds, you can see it. The figure, not clearly, the lighting is terrible and everything is moving, but enough to understand this isn't a bear, isn't a person in a suit, isn't anything that Bryce, with 15 years of wildlife biology experience, can easily categorize. It's massive, it's fast, and it's directly engaged with them in a way that suggests territorial defense or aggression. Then the camera cuts out. Later investigation revealed the battery was dislodged on impact. When footage resumes 11 minutes later, Bryce is on the ground, conscious but clearly injured. Russell is on the radio calling for Mireya to bring medical supplies, and whatever attacked them is gone, vanished back into the forest as suddenly as it appeared. But here's the detail that makes this more than just a scary encounter. The detail that elevated this from compelling television to genuine evidence that something happened. Bryce wasn't just shaken. He was physically injured in a way that required documentation and medical treatment. And those injuries tell a story that's difficult to explain away. When Mireya reached Bryce and Russell with the medical kit, her first priority was assessing injuries. Bryce was conscious, alert but clearly in pain. His left shoulder was damaged, later diagnosed as a partial dislocation that required professional medical treatment. But that wasn't what concerned Maria most. It was the marks on Bryce's back. Through his torn shirt, visible even in the poor lighting, were what appeared to be impact marks, not scratches or claw marks, which would suggest a bear or mountain lion attack. Impact bruising. 5 distinct points of pressure, arranged in a pattern that suggested a hand. A very large hand with fingers that left bruises through heavy outdoor clothing. The team documented everything. Photos from multiple angles, measurements of the bruise pattern, video of Bryce describing what he felt during the encounter. This wasn't dramatization for television. This was evidence collection following protocols that would hold up to scientific scrutiny, because all of them understood the significance of what they were documenting. The medical examination that followed, conducted by a physician in the nearest town who was briefed on the circumstances, revealed the extent of the injuries. The shoulder dislocation was consistent with being grabbed forcefully and pushed or thrown. The bruising pattern showed impact force significant enough to cause deep tissue damage through multiple layers of clothing, and the arrangement of the marks suggested a grip, not an impact from a fall or collision with an object. The doctor, speaking off the record, said the injury pattern was unusual. In his 15 years treating outdoor recreation injuries, hiking accidents, wildlife encounters, he'd seen plenty of bear attacks, mountain lion encounters, falls from climbing. This didn't match any standard pattern. The force required to create those bruises through heavy clothing suggested something very strong, and the hand-like arrangement, if that's what it was, indicated digits significantly larger than human. But physical injuries were only part of the evidence. The cameras had been rolling through most of the encounter, and when the team reviewed that footage, analyzing every frame, they found details that were even more disturbing than Bryce's injury. Details that suggested whatever attacked him was more intelligent, more aware than any known North American wildlife. The thermal footage from that night has been analyzed by multiple experts, wildlife biologists, thermal imaging specialists, even primatologists who study great ape behavior. And while interpretations vary, certain details are consistently noted across all analyses. First, the heat signature shows bipedal locomotion that's smoother and more coordinated than what you'd see from a bear walking upright. Bears can stand on hind legs, but their movement in that position is awkward, unstable. This figure moved with fluidity, purpose. The gait suggested an animal designed for bipedal movement, not one temporarily adopting an uncomfortable stance. Second, the speed of approach when Bryce stumbled. One wildlife biologist calculated that based on the distance covered and time elapsed, the figure was moving at approximately 25 miles per hour through dense forest at night. That's fast for any large animal, but especially remarkable for something moving upright through terrain with significant obstacles. Third, and perhaps most significant, is the behavior pattern. The initial approach was measured, almost cautious. The figure moved parallel to the investigators, maintaining distance, observing. This suggests awareness and decision-making. When they tried to close distance, it responded by approaching, but still in a controlled manner. The explosive rush only came after Bryce's stumble, which could be interpreted as a threat response to sudden movement. This behavioral pattern doesn't match standard predator behavior. If this was a bear or mountain lion viewing them as prey, the attack would have come differently. Predators don't usually give warnings or make themselves visible before attack. They use surprise, ambush. The fact that this figure was visible on thermal for minutes before the encounter suggests it wasn't trying to hunt them covertly. Some experts who reviewed the footage suggested the behavior was more consistent with territorial defense. The figure was making itself known, establishing dominance, warning the intruders to leave. When that warning was ignored and the humans continued approaching, it escalated to physical confrontation. But crucially, it didn't continue the attack. Once Bryce was down, once the threat was neutralized, it withdrew. That restraint is significant. If this was a mindless, aggressive animal, you'd expect the attack to continue until the threat was completely eliminated or driven away. Instead, there was what appeared to be a measured response, enough force to establish dominance and remove the perceived threat, but not continued aggression beyond what was necessary. That suggests intelligence, decision-making capacity, possibly even something approaching rational thought. But the most compelling piece of evidence, the detail that still generates debate among researchers, came from the audio analysis. Because when experts isolated and enhanced the vocalization captured during the encounter, they found something that shouldn't exist in North American wildlife. Audio analysis of wildlife vocalizations follows established scientific protocols. You compare the recording against cataloged sounds from known species, analyzing frequency range, duration, complexity, and acoustic structure. Most animal sounds fall into predictable patterns. Even rare or unusual vocalizations can typically be matched to a known species or categorized within a family group. The vocalization captured during Bryce's encounter didn't match anything in the database. Dr. Maria Mayer, who has extensive experience with primate vocalizations from her years studying lemurs in Madagascar and searching for new species, said it was unlike any ape or monkey call she'd encountered. The frequency range was too broad, starting in the low register that suggested a large chest cavity, then rising to pitches that would require complex vocal structures. Audio specialists brought in to analyze the recording identified multiple concerning details. First, the duration. The vocalization lasted approximately 7 seconds, far longer than typical bear vocalizations or mountain lion screams. Second, the complexity. There were tonal shifts within the call that suggested controlled modulation, not just involuntary sound production. But here's what really disturbed the experts. When they isolated and enhanced the audio, removing background noise and amplifying the primary vocalization, they found what sounded like structure. Not language, nobody is claiming that, but rhythmic elements, patterns within the sound that suggested intentional communication rather than simple emotional expression. One primatologist who reviewed the audio off the record said it reminded him of great ape threat displays. Gorillas, chimpanzees, and orangutans all have specific vocalizations used to establish dominance or warn away threats. This sound had similar elements: loud volume designed to intimidate, prolonged duration to demonstrate capacity, tonal shifts that might convey emotional state or intention. But it was more complex than any known great ape vocalization, suggesting a larger animal with more sophisticated vocal apparatus. The team also captured what happened after the vocalization: silence, complete silence. Even the ambient forest noise that had been present throughout the evening, distant insects, slight wind in trees, disappeared, as if every living thing in that valley stopped making sound when this creature vocalized. That kind of response suggests a recognized apex predator, something that other animals know and fear. Audio evidence alone doesn't prove Bigfoot exists, but combined with the thermal footage, the injury pattern, the behavioral observation, it adds another piece to a puzzle that's becoming increasingly difficult to explain away with conventional wildlife. And that cumulative evidence is what made Bryce's encounter different from hundreds of other Bigfoot sighting claims. The most significant impact of the attack wasn't the physical injuries, though those took weeks to fully heal. It was the psychological and philosophical shift in Bryce Johnson himself. The man who'd spent 3 seasons of Expedition Bigfoot carefully maintaining scientific skepticism was fundamentally changed by 11 minutes in a dark forest. In interviews after the incident, Bryce struggled to articulate what changed. He'd been attacked by wildlife before during his career as a biologist. He'd had close encounters with bears, been charged by elk, dealt with aggressive mountains. Those experiences were frightening in the moment, but ultimately explainable within his understanding of animal behavior. This was different. Bryce described the encounter as facing something that was aware of him in a way that felt almost human. Not the instinctive awareness that animals have of threats or food sources, but conscious recognition. He said it felt like being evaluated, assessed, like whatever was out there was making decisions about him based on observation and analysis, not just reacting instinctively. That sense of being recognized by something unknown shook Bryce's scientific worldview. Because if Bigfoot exists, if there's a large bipedal primate living in North American forests that science hasn't documented, that changes fundamental assumptions about biology, ecology, anthropology, it means we've missed something enormous, that our understanding of what's possible in these environments is incomplete. But more personally, it meant Bryce had to reconsider years of dismissing evidence, explaining away sightings, maintaining that skeptical barrier. He'd looked at thermal footage before and found reasons to doubt, heard vocalizations and suggested more mundane explanations, examined footprints and pointed out inconsistencies. Now he understood that his skepticism, while scientifically appropriate, might have blinded him to something real. His colleagues noticed the change immediately. Mireya said Bryce became more open to possibilities he'd previously dismissed. Russell noted that Bryce stopped automatically looking for conventional explanations and started seriously considering that some evidence might be exactly what it appeared to be, proof of an unknown species. But Bryce was careful not to swing too far in the other direction. He didn't abandon scientific rigor or start accepting every piece of questionable evidence. Instead, he developed what he called informed openness, maintaining standards of proof while acknowledging that his personal experience suggested the standards might actually be met by genuine Bigfoot evidence if examined without predetermined bias. The transformation of Bryce Johnson from skeptic to experiencer represents something significant in Bigfoot research, because experiencers, people who claim direct encounters, are often dismissed by scientists. But when a trained biologist with impeccable credentials and a documented history of skepticism has an encounter, documents it with multiple cameras and instruments, and shows physical injuries consistent with his account, that carries weight. The episode featuring Bryce's attack became one one of the most watched in Expedition Bigfoot history, but the response was divided. True believers in Bigfoot's existence saw it as the most compelling evidence ever captured on television. Skeptics raised questions about what the footage actually showed and whether injuries could have other explanations. Online analysis of the thermal footage exploded across social media and Bigfoot research forums, frame-by-frame breakdowns, enhancement attempts, debates about whether the heat signature showed features consistent with an unknown primate or could be explained as a bear. Some argued the movement was too fluid for a bear. Others pointed out that in poor lighting and chaotic circumstances, misidentification was always possible. The injuries became a particular point of controversy. Medical professionals who examined photos of Bryce's bruising noted it was consistent with impact from a large hand, but some argued that falling against a branch or rock formation could create similar patterns. The shoulder dislocation was definitely real, confirmed by X-rays and medical treatment, but its cause remained subject to interpretation. What couldn't be disputed was that something happened. Bryce had real injuries requiring real medical care. Multiple cameras captured footage of something large moving through the forest. Audio recorded vocalizations that experts couldn't definitively attribute to known species. Whether that added up to proof of Bigfoot or an unusually dramatic bear encounter remained debatable, but it wasn't nothing. The production team made a decision that surprised some viewers. They released the raw footage, not just the edited episode version, to allow independent analysis. This included the thermal imaging files in their original format, audio recordings without enhancement, and even the footage from those 11 minutes when the camera was on the ground capturing fragments of the encounter. This transparency was deliberate. The team knew that keeping footage secret would fuel conspiracy theories about editing or manipulation. By releasing everything for independent analysis, they invited scrutiny. Some researchers found additional details in the raw footage that supported the Bigfoot interpretation. Others used the same footage to argue for more conventional explanations. But the conversation was happening based on actual evidence, not speculation about what might be hidden. Bryce himself became more reserved about discussing the encounter in public. He'd give factual accounts of what happened, describe his injury, explain the evidence collected, but he avoided sensationalizing or making definitive claims. When asked directly if he believed he was attacked by Bigfoot, his answer was carefully measured. He experienced something that didn't match his extensive knowledge of North American wildlife, and the evidence collected was consistent with encounter with a large, unknown bipedal creature.